He fixed what was broken in other people's lives the way he fixed engines. Patient, hands dark with grease, eyes trained to find a problem by sound. Jacob's world was the size of a one-bay garage on the corner of a street that smelled of motor oil and fried plantain. He had a tin roof over his head, a wife named Mariam, who kept the small house spotless, and a little daughter, Helen, who learned to count on the rivets of the toolbox. That life had rhythms: work at dawn, pause for the radio, a laugh over a bowl of akara with the men from the market, and an evening spent teaching Helen to read the letters on a torn cereal box. Pride was a muscle he kept taut. He wore it the way he wore his overalls, threadbare at the elbows but clean. Then came a night that didn't belong to his life. She called a different kind of name into the dark. She arrived at his garage with a car that wouldn't hold itself together, a stately thing that seemed to grieve for the road. The woman who stepped out of it moved like someone who had never needed an explanation for anything. At 65, she carried an empire in the way her coat folded, in the quiet way she watched men make excuses and then quietly made them disappear. Jacob had seen people from the city come through before, young men with sharp jackets, middle-aged ministers with palms that smelled of money. But she was different. People in the township whispered as she walked by. She had been on billboards once. She was the name at the bottom of building projects, the woman who lent schools their roofs and reclaimed whole streets. Amanda Okoro was the kind of person who rewrote the frame around ordinary days. He worked on her car. She stayed. Neither of them framed it as more than a convenience at first. An oil leak fixed, a flat tire patched. She had a private, unobtrusive curiosity about the mechanics of small lives. Jacob felt seen in a way his neighbors could never be troubled to do, not as a mechanic who could be cheaply used, but as a thing to be observed. Perhaps that is why, when she asked him to come to a small dinner at her house, just the two of them, he went. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the quiet, dangerous hope that wealth might not be entirely alien. They had sex in a house that smelled like eucalyptus and polished wood. It was clumsy and tender, the sort of mismatch that produces regret in daylight and an ache at night. For Jacob, it was less about the act than the aftermath, a feeling that his small life and her enormous one could touch without breaking. He left that night with a handprint around his heart, and the certainty that such things, if they mattered at all, were to be hidden. He went home to Mariam and Helen, to the familiar half-lit kitchen where the kettle whispered and his daughter hummed a tune about a smiling moon. He did not tell her. He could not. Weeks later, Jacob felt the world tilt, a sickness that wasn't hunger, a fluttering inside that sat like a secret. When he told Mariam, she cried, not because she was angry, but because the chances seemed so small. A child from a woman like Amanda, a woman who could erase or elevate a life with a call. The stoicism he had built around himself felt suddenly unfit. He began to calculate, names to call, people to avoid, ways to keep Helen from knowing too much. He kept the news like a coin in a fist. Amanda, on her side, was careful and efficient. She did not unravel into declarations and promises. She sent messages that were measured. An invitation to a clinic for a consultation came without fanfare. Gifts arrived for Mariam, a blanket, a little dress that smelled faintly of lavender, always with a card that said, simply, "Congratulations." The gifts were a map, and Jacob read them like a man trying not to drown. At times she was kind. At other moments she was distant as glass. The empire taught her to weigh every action for how it landed in public. That habit made her generous with resources and stingy with risk. There was a single, hot day when the decision resolved itself into motion. Jacob walked through the doors of a hospital that bled white into every hallway, a place for people with money and people who could barter for favors. Amanda's private suite was on the top floor, her bed arranged by staff who had been trained to keep her comfortable. Jacob waited in the corridor while nurses moved like a tide. He watched Amanda behind the glass of the delivery room, face taut with something between fear and resolve. The baby arrived amid a chorus of sterile beeps and folded linen. A nurse brought a tiny, fragile bundle to Amanda and placed it on her chest. The lullaby hummed overhead was gentle and impersonal. The nursery was a room of glass boxes and wrapped bracelets. Jacob saw the moment through the bright window. A nurse pinning a bracelet on a newborn's wrist. Another nurse cutting a cord. The soft whimper of new life. He had not expected to see Amaka there, Amanda's sister, leaning too close, with a hand that moved with practiced urgency. Amaka had been in Amanda's orbit for years, an operative disguised as family. She had a way of smiling too widely and then looking away fast. Doctor. Admi, the hospital man who bent rules like they were bendable, had been bribed before. Jacob did not know the contours of their plan, only its outcome. Inside the nursery, their hands moved like a pair of thieves. Under the hum of fluorescent light, one newborn went out, another came in. A blind baby, tiny, wide-eyed in a different way, was wrapped and brought to Amanda, as if the exchange were ordinary, as if the final assignment of babies was simply clerical. The other baby, robust and crying, was slid away in a bundle that smelled faintly of starch and detergent. It was efficient. It was heartless. It was over in 2 minutes. Jacob waited in the corridor, but he was not allowed beyond the satin rope. He watched through a sliver of glass and saw a nurse hand Amanda the blind infant. Amanda cradled it like someone touching a relic. The child hiccuped and let out a small, sorrowful cry. Jacob wanted to climb the stairs and claim the life that thudding in his belly had promised, to say with his chest and his name that this child was his. Instead, he watched and saw a sister, Amaka, place something into Dr. Adami's palm, a small bulge that disappeared into a pocket the way secrets hide. He saw no words spoken, only faces set in the same neutral language the rich use to ask favors and conceal debts. After the delivery, things moved in the way machines do when someone has pressed an invisible button, quickly, efficiently, leaving an oily residue of favors and guilt. Amanda signed forms that erased the presence of any other claim. Nurses cleaned the cradle. A lawyer's assistant prepared papers. The staff moved as though they had performed an unremarkable task and would receive in return things that would prevent questions. Jacob, who had come to claim a child, met Amanda in a corridor with the narrow light of hallway bulbs catching at her cheekbones. He spoke about paternity in a voice that wavered between hope and accusation. He expected anger. He expected a fight. Instead, Amanda's response was calibrated like everything she had ever done around public life. Measured, cool, designed to protect a future she had already spent time building in her head. She did not deny the possibility of his claim outright. She chose instead to frame it as a complication that could be managed. She offered money in an envelope, small bills folded into a cheap paper, an exchange that smelled of apology and calculation. Her eyes were not unkind, they were strategic. She said she would provide for the child, but that their involvement, his involvement, would need to be limited for the sake of everyone. To Jacob, it burned like salt. He took the envelope because hunger and pride had different ways of dictating truth. Mariam's face flashed in his mind, the way she had clutched the tiny blanket delivered earlier. He thought of Helen and how scandal could carve a family's life into unrecognizable pieces. The money felt like a suppression order disguised as charity. Amanda's help was presented as dignity, but folded into it was the instruction to vanish quietly. "Take this," she told him. Her voice was soft, the wrong kind of pity. "For now, for the child's care, for you and your family." He could have turned the envelope away, have demanded recognition in public, defended an honesty that would have cost him everything. Instead, he took it, because the world that fed him worked in ways that beautiful, firm hands did not understand. It was the moment that defined the betrayal. Amanda had not staged the swap with her own hands. She had not shoved the other newborn into a suitcase or issued orders to beat a man into silence. But she had closed the circle. She lent her power as balm and bandage in equal measure, choosing a solution that protected her name and left Jacob exposed. That decision, calculated, private, and decisive, was a blade hidden in velvet. After the conversation, Jacob walked back to the gate, the thin envelope heavy in his pocket, and heavier still in his conscience. For a fever-bright hour, he told himself he had done the right thing. He had secured provision for the child, for Mariam, for Helen. He had kept his family from gossip, from shame. But shame is an animal that does not rest. The money sat in his palm, like a bribe labeled love. When he returned to the neighborhood, men who worked for a marker awaited him in the shadow of a wall. They did not speak the language of reason. They spoke the language of intimidation, gestures, fists, the kind of bruises that are meant not only to hurt, but to remind a man of his place. Jacob had been warned before. Step out of line and the family would look away. He had known, in the abstract, that wealth had armies. He had not expected the immediacy of their power. They struck him without discussion. He tried to protect himself, but his hands were meant to lift engines, not fend off men with money behind them. The blows were quick, efficient, practiced. One of them pushed him into a gutter. Another slapped the back of his head in a way that made the world tilt into sound. The men left a note in his shirt pocket and an instruction in their eyes. Forget or suffer more. He scrambled up, breathful, certain of many things at once, the bitterness of blood on his teeth, the tremor of embarrassment, the scent of diesel clinging to his clothes like a second skin. When he walked back through his front door, Mariam was sitting at the table with Helen asleep across her lap, a steaming bowl cooling between them. Jacob had to steady himself against the doorway, hands braced on the frame like they might not hold. For a moment, he considered pretending the night had been ordinary. Then he saw the worry carved on his wife's face, and the children of lies he had been building fell around him like scaffolding. Mariam demanded the truth in the quiet way of someone who had already guessed. The envelope fell from Jacob's pocket. When he opened his hand, the bills lay there with a mute accusation. He told her, halting and foolish, about the hospital, about Amanda's offer, about the men who had struck him. Words came like broken gears, stuttering and urgent. Mariam's face dissolved into a map of new fears. She pressed a hand to her mouth in a way Jacob would remember for years. Not the muffling of shock, but the attempt to keep a family small and salvage what it could. Against the lamp glow and the smell of cooling food, the household rearranged into a new shape. Helen slept through everything, oblivious to the ways adults could fracture. Mariam packed the bills into a tin box, folded them like they might be needed to pay off a debt or a nurse or medicine. The house felt smaller, walled by a secret and a new kind of cost that could not be counted in naira. Jacob slept that night on the floor of the tiny living room. The pain from his bruises flared and eased with every small movement. He thought about the baby in the hospital, about the blind child whom Amanda held. He did not know the child's name, but he felt the weight of that little life on his chest like a physical thing. He thought about Amanda's face in the corridor, the way her hands had not trembled. He thought about Amarka's grin and Dr. Admi's stoic eyes. He thought about the envelope and the way it had felt like mercy and a handcuff at once. In the mornings, the town stitched itself together with 1,000 small tasks. Jacob returned to the garage, hands working on a carburetor, as if the world might stay sane if he could fix the parts that made it go. But the work found new meaning and new limits. Men who once had been regulars in his bay avoided his gaze. Conversations that had been friendly turned into invitations with stilted uncertainty. Rumors began, as they always did. Some said the woman had a scandal. Some believed what they wanted, that a poor man had been used and then given money to vanish. None of it repaired the way Jacob's chest ached when he thought of the child that had not been given to him. Amanda continued to appear in public like someone who could afford to be kind and remote. She hosted dinners that fed the city's gratitude, signed grants with a pen that made foundations bloom. In an op-ed that spoke of empowerment, she was praised as a woman who gave back. Her name was often followed by a list of projects and donations. The cameras loved her ease and her money. Jacob, who had been only a footnote in that world, saw how narratives could be curated and how truths could be shelved. Her choice had been private, but its ripples were public. Months slid into a brittle sort of normal. Jacob learned to count his days by the squeal of a wheel or the time the market closed. Mariam grew hesitant when visitors knocked. She watched Jacob with a tenderness that was more guarded than before. Helen drew pictures of a baby with large round eyes and a smile she had invented. At night, Jacob would sometimes lie awake and imagine two futures at once. One where the child had been born into their home, where the curtains would move and the neighbor women would bring pots of soup. The other, where the child grew into a life with names like suits and staff and blinds that open only when invited. From Amanda's angle, the decision looked different in the mirrors she kept. The public ones, the private ones, the ones stitched into the backs of buildings with plaques bearing her name. She had been frightened, she told herself. At 65, the word scandal could topple empires, business alliances, philanthropic influence, social standing. She had been raised to regard reputation as currency. She had learned to make choices that preserved the greater good as she perceived it, to act as an administrator of consequence. She had not walked through the beating men. She had not felt the envelope burn the way Jacob did. She had thought, perhaps, that keeping the child close meant protection. A life under her roof would be cleaner, safer, and medically tended. She told herself that the money and the discretion were necessary compromises. There were nights Amanda lay awake in a suite that looked out over the city and catalogued her options. She thought about the strengths of a family name and the fragility of a man's pride. She thought about the blind child on her lap, whose fingers curled around her thumb in an absoluteness that did not negotiate with public opinion. She felt a complicated stitch of tenderness and fear. But compassion without risk kept the worst kinds of convenience alive. The kind that lets one keep affection without accountability. That convenience sustained the surface for a while. Amanda made occasional visits to the hospital to oversee the child's care. She bought treatments, paid for specialists, hired tutors who knew how to teach a child by touch. On paper it looked like charity. In the neighborhood it looked like distance. She issued measured press statements about philanthropy and commitment to children's health. People applauded the blind child's improvement, the rigorous care. Jacob watched from a corner of his life as the city lauded the rich woman's beneficence. He saw that gifts could be a screen through which true things were filtered. Underneath the curated sheen, other hands worked. Amarka moved like a conductor, orchestrating quietly and without remorse. She visited the clinic under the guise of family and arranged for the right people to be near the right rooms. Dr. Admi received envelopes that made his mortgage look smaller. He made clinical decisions that were advantageous and then wrote them in notes that looked like standard procedure. The hospital, like many institutions, had rooms where ethics blurred into patronage. Those rooms could be bought. Jacob, still fragmented by the sting of the envelope, still marked by the beating, tried to stitch a life from the remains. He took on extra shifts at the garage. He did odd jobs in the market. He ate smaller meals. He stopped leaving his house after dark. He guarded his family's dignity like a fragile shelf. But humiliation clings. The memory of a rich woman's hand offering the envelope, the feel of the paper between his fingers, the way his community's whispers changed his place in it. These things gnawed. On a day that began with a sky so bright it seemed to mock the low lights of the district, Jacob found a small piece of hope. A letter from a social worker at St. Mary's orphanage. It was a bureaucratic thing, lined paper with an official stamp, and it reported the presence of a boy named Philip, a child whose details matched the sort of infant taken from hospital wards. The letter suggested the possibility of identifying a parent. At first, Jacob thought it a mistake, another ledger error, but the name pried at him like a splinter. He went to the orphanage under the pretense of delivering tools for the maintenance man. The orphanage smelled of disinfectant and old bread. Children played under makeshift swings, while older women in uniforms herded them like careful geese. Philip was taller than he had expected, lean, with an expression of attention that sometimes felt like accusation. He was wary of adults and spoke little. The woman who met Jacob there, thin-lipped and practical, spoke of neglected meals, of a boy who had the look of someone who had been taught not to expect much. Jacob watched him and felt a fierce, immediate tenderness. He felt the first ember of a father's stubbornness. He left the orphanage with a pamphlet and the taste of resolve. There was no legal pathway easy enough for a man of his means. Going to court would cost money he did not possess. It would force him into an arena where Amanda's name would orbit the judges like a halo. Yet something in Jacob had shifted. He would not accept being a footnote in a story written by people with better pens. That night, under the low-ceilinged kitchen lamp, he told Mariam about Philip. Her pained face said everything he needed to know, that she feared the exposure, that she feared being branded by a society that equates poverty with failure. She feared for Helen, for the subtle ways children inherit shame. But she did not tell him to stop. Instead, she breathed into his face and gave him a small, stubborn permission. Do what you must, but be careful. Her approval was a prayer and a charge. He started keeping a ledger. He walked to the orphanage when he could, left packages of soap and little shirts, watched from the far side as Philip learned to tie his shoes. He spoke to the boy in small fragments. I fix motors, he told him once. I can fix other things too. The boy didn't laugh. He watched Jacob with a guarded intelligence, as if measuring whether this man could be depended upon. Meanwhile, Amanda received updates about a boy in a distant orphanage. She read them with an even hand, and then set them aside. She kept the blind child, Peter, well supplied and professionally educated. She made sure he had tutors who could teach Braille, therapists who could make a city navigable in other ways. To the public, she was a savior. To Jacob, she was the architect of his undoing. Her distance was a kind of cruelty, one that could be dressed in satin and described as prudence. The town continued to speak in whispers. Jacob's name was not a scandal, not yet. But there were nights when a man at the market would say he had a friend whose cousin worked for Amanda and had seen things. Rumors are like moths. They find fabric and start to chew. Jacob worked, saved, visited the orphanage, felt the weight of his family. He bore the cost of a choice he had not made alone. At the edge of that first year, an incident pushed everything toward a fracture. A careless nurse at Amanda's suite left a window ajar. A delivery man, drunk and cruel, stumbled into the corridor where a small child was learning to find his way down a flight of stairs. It was not a cinematic fall. It was a misstep, a push that could be argued as accident. Peter toppled down, and the suitcases of decision and consequence spilled open. When news reached Jacob, an anonymous tip that a child had been hurt at the Billionaire's home, it came as a small, bright shock. He went to the hospital now, not as a supplicant, but as someone who could not ignore an injury close enough to touch his own past. He watched as nurses swabbed a wound and examined fingers. The nurses murmured about tests. Blood was taken. In small vials it looked unremarkable, like any human blood. But blood, in a different language, is a key. A slip of truth. Someone in the hospital did what someone else couldn't or wouldn't. They pushed a swab into the genetics lab and ran it. The result was a quiet administrative note that changed the air. The child in Amanda's care was not related to Amanda, and he was not related to the man who had claimed paternity. That simple, clinical sentence detonated like a bomb under the polished floors. It meant what Jacob had feared, a mismatch. It meant the circle had been closed around a lie. When Jacob received the news, what rose was not triumphant joy. It was a cold, jagged thing that cut through years of shame and resignation. For the first time since the night of the envelope, he felt a narrative tilt. The hospital's thin bureaucracy, the lab's quiet machines, had produced a piece of evidence that did not care for rank or retainer. The small vial in a tray had staged a reversal. Truth had been given a path. He returned to Amanda's building with a determination that felt foreign. He had been careful to avoid making a spectacle of himself, but the vial had married hope to procedure. He asked to speak to her. He came with the lab's note folded in his palm like a talisman. Underneath the chandeliered lobby, he stood and waited. She appeared, composed as if the world was always supposed to orbit her arrival. When she saw him, there was a flicker, not of recognition, but of the calculation that would have to follow. The city had already begun to notice a story that smelled of human error and institutional rot. Papers are animalistic about scandals. Amanda's staff moved quickly, lawyers whispering. Dr. Admi was summoned. Amarka called in, and the textures of their smiles changed. Jacob felt the air make more sense, as if a map had been unfolded in front of him. But the map revealed not only perpetrators, but choices. Amanda could have used her influence to find the truth earlier. She could have insisted they tell him. Instead, she had threaded a line through secrecy and charity that made her the architect of Jacob's pain. The vial's results shifted the blame from the bumbling misfortune of human error to a pattern of decisions that protected a reputation at the expense of a man and a child. When the hospital's CCTV footage was requested, the small machines that watch everything were reluctant to cooperate. They were, after all, the kind of evidence that could topple an arrangement. But paper and pixels move with a momentum of their own. Dr. Admi paled when the recording was replayed for him. Amarka, watching the screen in the hush, clenched her jaw. Amanda, who had kept her calculated distance, looked as if the floor had suddenly lost its guarantee. For Jacob, watching the footage was less about cinematic revelation and more about a slow, surgical exposure. The nursery's camera captured two figures, one pushing a cart, another reaching into the stack of prenatals and leaving with a different child. The swap was mechanical, unromantic. There was no drama to it, only the efficient cruelty of decisions made in service of a reputation. The tape proved what Jacob had always suspected. The child he had been denied had been replaced, not lost. It proved what he had always feared, that wealth and fear could create a morality of its own. He felt rage then, a clean and terrible thing. It was not just the theft of a child. It was the theft of his dignity. Amanda had not been the hands that carried out the crime, but she had been the mind that allowed the arrangement to stand when it should have been dismantled. She had offered him an envelope instead of a name. She had given assistance instead of accountability. Her betrayal was not in a single act, but in a sustained pattern. The decision to keep the child close, to hush the room, to protect the circle. That pattern had cost him 5 years of fatherhood, had cost a boy the kind of care that is impossible to buy. The footage's release was a crack in the world that forced air into places that had dimmed. Jacob felt, for the first time in years, that the truth might extricate him from the narrow, shame-hollow space he had occupied. But truth was a double-edged blade. It could absolve him. It could also destroy what remained of his life. The men who had beaten him would likely be called to account. Amarka's network would not dissolve quietly. Amanda's empire could buckle under the weight of exposure. In the space between those outcomes, Jacob stood with a vial and a tape, and the rawness of a man who had been used as a convenience. He returned home that night, with the memory of the footage reel clicking through his head. Mariam waited with the radio on low, the news filling the edges of their small house. He did not know what the next steps would be. Lawyers, arrests, headlines. He only knew the shape of the wound and the fact that it had been opened. He put his hand on Helen's hair as she slept, feeling the softness of a life he had managed to keep small and safe. He went to bed with a trembling that was part fear and part new steel. Outside, the city continued its indifferent hum. Amanda's name flickered across press pages, couched in the careful language of institutions and philanthropy. The cameras would hunger for drama. The truth would be parceled out by those with power on all sides. Jacob, the mechanic with the oil-stained hands who had been given an envelope in place of a share in his child, finally understood the scale of what he had been fighting against. He also understood that the fight was no longer his alone. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe to follow the next chapter. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion collapse of polite arrangements. People who had believed in the narratives Amanda curated felt their trust leak away in the face of evidence. Amarka's composure showed hairline cracks. Dr. Adme's office emptied of envelopes and filled with subpoenas. The orphanage's records were combed. Press vans dotted the streets like insects drawn to something sweet and dangerous. Jacob found himself pulled toward the center of a storm he had never sought. The police came with questions and forms. They took statements in rooms that smelled of lemon cleaner and authority. They asked about the envelope and about the men who had beat him. He told the truth, carefully, without flourish. He watched Amanda from a distance and saw something he had not expected. Not a grotesque villain, but a woman whose face had been carved by choices and preservation. She met with lawyers and made statements about error and trust, about the need to find answers for the children's sake. She spoke with a voice that asked for understanding, and in that ask lay the same self-serving mercy she had offered him years before. At night, Jacob replayed the footage in his mind. The swap was a seam in the city's fabric, but stitches had been made with more than thread. They had used money, influence, and fear. He had seen the men who had beaten him in the street again, walking in clean shoes and clean consciences. He had seen Amarka's hands. He had seen Dr. Adme's notes. Now, however, the tape showed more than a plan. It showed a failure of human decency that could be traced. As the police worked in slow, bureaucratic ways, Jacob's community leaned toward him with a new kind of attention. Some with compassion, some with the leering curiosity that asks how scandals might include them in story. Donations of food and small amounts of money trickled in. People offered to testify if they had seen anything. A local journalist asked to interview him, and then did, but folded the narrative into a shape more sympathetic to the woman who gave away hospitals than to the man who had refused fame. That stung. Narrative, Jacob learned, had its own politics. The legal process moved like a great machine, intent on self-protection. Amanda hired counsel with the kind of names that made people feel the truth might be bargained away. She gave public statements about her love for the child in her care and her desire for a just resolution. To some, she looked like a woman being persecuted by a system that unfairly targeted generosity. To others, she looked like a woman who had made a series of choices that privileged image over cost. Jacob's point of view was complex and raw. He loved the child he had not seen and hated the woman who had given him an envelope. The two could, he realized, coexist. In the days when the city was ripe with rumor and the hospital doors were under new scrutiny, Jacob visited the orphanage again. Philip had grown more guarded, but there was an odd recognition in the boy's eyes when Jacob kneeled and touched his shoulder. It was the recognition of a man who might finally be offered a chance to be more than a ghost in a child's life. Yet Jacob also felt an ache for the child in Amanda's care, the blind boy taught by tutors, wrapped in a different kind of loneliness. That child's welfare gnawed at him. Hatred, he found, made strange allies of tenderness. At home, Mariam watched Jacob with a concerned pride that threatened to break into fear. She had been the anchor of the household these many years. Now she carried a new role as confidant and strategist. "Be careful," she said, not once, but like a car that warns in a steady, mechanical rattle. She whispered of neighbors who had tightened their mouths, of people who had been paid to lull questions. She listened when Jacob said he could not let this rest. And so the puzzle pieces began to move. Police investigators requesting CCTV, a quiet man from the lab confirming the DNA tests, a reporter pressing a microphone near Amanda's podium. Jacob felt the tiny gears of justice grind, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt that maybe the hands that had moved his life like chess pieces would be forced to show themselves. But even as investigations veered forward, Jacob braced for the price. Bringing a giant to heel is a dangerous thing. Amanda's world was thick with friends and gratitude and boards of trustees, with men who saw their fortunes connected to hers in invisible lines. The man who had been beaten in the gutter understood the danger of pulling at a loose thread. He also understood the rip that would come if he did not. One clear morning, as the dew still made the tin roof of the garage sing, Jacob made a decision that would widen the story into something no one could comfortably contain. He took the photographs of Philip that the orphanage had given him, the lab notes printed with precise letters and numbers, and he walked to the local precinct. The doors of the station squeaked with a bureaucratic lament. He clutched his proofs like oilcloth, warm from the press of his hands. He set them down on a table where a plain man with tired eyes looked at them with the kind of professional boredom that hides a conscience. "Start a case," Jacob said. The man looked at him, at the papers, at the determined slope of his mouth. For a second, something like sympathy flickered. "We can file a report," he said. "We can open an investigation." But Jacob knew the but already. He had bribed men who broke bones into helping maintain silence. He had accepted an envelope instead of a name. He knew a system that could be bought and a process that could be slowed. He knew the work ahead would be long and messy. But as he left the station, with the weight of his choices and the thin cake of hope in his chest, he felt something resolve that had been assembling since that night in the corridor when Amanda had pressed paper into his hand. There would be consequences. There would be reprisals. There would be legal entanglements and wounds that took longer than headlines to heal. He did not know which shape they would take. He only knew that, for all the times he had accepted the small compromises, something in him could not let the matter rest as it had. That afternoon, he went to the orphanage and sat with Philip under an awning while the rain came in thin sheets. Philip watched the water and did not flinch. Jacob told him, in fragments, of his intent. He could not promise a suit or a neat legal victory. He could only promise that he would try. The boy listened as if he had all the time in the world to measure the truth of a man. Far away, inside rooms padded with power, Amanda heard of the police's renewed attention. She consulted lawyers who spoke in soft, precise ways. She felt, beneath her composure, a current of fear. It was not fear of prison. She had contingency plans for almost everything. It was fear of the quiet that might replace the applause if the story turned. It was fear of what it meant to know she had been complicit in a decision that had ruined a man. Jacob, who had tightened his chest around a small flame of resolve, did not yet know how heated the next months would be. He only knew he had stepped into a fight that would ask more than the price of an envelope. He had taken a match to a seam, and though the fabric would not burn cleanly, it would be forced open. The first court summons arrived like a curt wind through the township. a thin envelope with an official stamp that announced the city's attention had sharpened into procedure. Police officers, who had seemed at once distant and solicitous, now moved with a different weight. They took statements in rooms that smelled faintly of lemon and paper. Detectives with neat pens asked Jacob for names, dates, memories. They wanted the ledger of a life he had kept in his head and in a few stubborn scraps of paper. He answered with the economy of a man who had learned to protect what could be protected. Facts, times, the things that could be matched against video and blood. Meanwhile, the building that bore Amanda Okoro's name began to feel suddenly porous. The foundation that had seemed unshakable for decades creaked with the pressure of inquiry. Boards convened, publicists drafted statements. A legal team that could buy and sell reputations moved like a shield around her. Amanda stayed composed in public, the same way she had stayed composed the night she folded money and handed it over. But private composition was harder to maintain. She slept in shorter stretches. She read statements that catalogued her omissions and felt a particular kind of shame that has no currency attached to it. Only the knowledge that a life had been rearranged to suit her needs. CCTV footage was the thing that turned speculation into action. The tape was not cinematic. There were no dramatic reveals, no close-ups that insisted on villainy. There was the grainy, indifferent eye of a camera that recorded routine movements. A cart rolling, a nurse checking a clipboard, a hand reaching under a blanket, and another hand lifting a different bundle. The exchange lasted only minutes. Its ordinariness made it worse. Seeing it played back, without the gloss of rumor or the shielding nature of polite conjecture, made a mockery of the careful stories Amanda's team had prepared. Detectives moved quickly from the footage to subpoenas. Dr. Admi, who had maintained a smooth, avuncular air in his clinic, was brought into a sterile room and listened to accusations that his signature and his notes no longer protected. He faltered when confronted with the ledger of envelopes, the receipts that linked his life to Amarka's generosity. Confrontation, bordered by evidence, can make small men tremble. Amarka, for all her practiced ferocity in corridors and back rooms, found herself in a seat that removed the armor of family. She was questioned about motives and transactions. Questions for her were blunt and met with the kind of silence that had once been useful to seal deals. Chisholm and Emma, who had kept the street crooked with the threat of fists and force, were not invisible to the cameras and the detectives' lists. Rumors that had been whispered in market stalls were given direction and weight. Witnesses who had avoided involvement now stood under the relief that truth could offer and named people who had met with Amarka or who had taken small envelopes for small crimes. There are moments in any community when the balance shifts and people who kept quiet for safety decide that a different kind of safety, truth, must be attempted. When arrests were made, they were deliberate. Men in plain clothes arrived at houses at dawn, their steps careful but unyielding. Chisholm, found in a guest room surrounded by papers that suggested shadow accounts, tried the old tricks. Denials, bluster, a promise of silence in exchange for delay. It did not hold. Emma's phone betrayed a string of messages that matched movements on the tape. Dr. Admi sat in cuffs, not because he was a kingpin, but because the ledger of favors had stacked into a pattern that could no longer be called an accident. Amarka was taken from a meeting with a patron and placed into a police car without ceremony. The arrests were not a movie climax. They were legal motions that made possibility into reality. Someone would be called to account. The city reacted with predictable spectacle. Cameras filmed the procession of people from police vans into courtrooms. Commentary collided with pity and outrage. For Jacob, the media attention was a different kind of exposure. He felt his likeness, his story, splashed into places it had never been welcome. Some segments told his story with care. Others cast him as a small man, caught up in a tapestry bigger than he could comprehend. He sat for interviews that tired him. He watched his picture flicker across screens and felt a surge of complex feelings. Relief, anger, victory, a new shame that came with being made a public exemplar of private pain. The legal mechanics followed. A judge received the footage and the DNA reports and ordered a battery of further tests and hearings. The genetic match, the clean statement that the boy in the orphanage was biologically Jacob's, moved quickly in the court of evidence. DNA does not argue with social position. It only speaks in match percentages and base pairs. When the lab confirmed that Philip's genetic markers aligned with Jacob's, the case tilted. Emergency custody hearings were arranged with the kind of care courts show when a child's welfare is at stake. The defense made arguments about stability, about the boy's current life, and the complexity of reparenting, and those arguments were heard. They were not decisive. Biology had a voice that mattered in a legal sense, and for Jacob, it mattered in a human one. The reunion was not neat. Jacob walked into a small hearing room and saw Philip sitting beside a social worker, hands folded in a way that suggested he had been coached to be calm. When Jacob moved toward him, the boy's eyes, wary and astonished, measured him, as if deciding whether the stranger was safe. There was no Hollywood tearful collapse. There was a long, deliberate introduction. The social worker spoke of stable transitions and supervised visits. The judge, careful and competent, outlined a plan that would not wrench Philip out of every known support, but would allow the boy to meet the man whose blood ran in his veins. Jacob's hands shook as the social worker guided him to the child. Philip came forward with a slow, studied movement, and then simply leaned into Jacob's chest like a compass finding its true north. The first embrace between father and son was simple and terrible, a small boy folding into an adult who smelled of oil and the market, a man who had kept a fragile hope like a small ember inside his ribcage for 5 years. There were no cinematic reunions, no sudden cures for the years lost. Jacob could not recover the time that had been stolen. He could not substitute for the dinners missed or the years of inconsistent care. There was only this minute, the warmth of breath against his collar, the immediate, irrefutable truth of skin against skin. Philip's fingers traced the seam at the wrist where a bracelet had once been, as if seeking an anchor. Jacob pressed his cheek to the child's hair and felt something like being made whole and being hollow at the same time. Amanda watched that reunion from across a gallery reserved for the public. She sat with a lawyer at her side. Her hands lay folded in an exact symmetry she had learned long ago. She felt the scene as if it were a wound. Watching Jacob hold his son was like watching someone else be given the life she had doctored into possession. She could say, as she had told herself in private, that she had tried to protect the boy from the chaotic glare of public life, that she had wanted to give him the best care and doctor's money could fetch. But the sight of them, father and son, unmade an alibi of sorts. That the law had moved to right what had been wronged made her feel small in a way that held no political remedy. In the days after the hearing, Jacob was given supervised parental rights that allowed for gradual responsibility building. Social workers counseled him and Mariam about parenting after separation. The child needed routine, medical assessments, the stability of schooling. There were practical hurdles, legal fees, the logistics of extra visits, the taunting voices of people who thought a man like Jacob had suddenly become a spectacle of pity. But the small offices where paperwork filled would become arenas for a different kind of work. Mending routines, building a system where Philip could know bedtime stories and proper meals, and the feel of a father's hand steady at his back. Meanwhile, Amanda's world shifted tectonically. Boards disavowed her with the swiftness of institutions that must protect themselves. She resigned from positions she had held for years. Trustees announced independent inquiries. Philanthropic foundations she led announced pauses as audits were commissioned. For the first time in decades, her name was attached in news cycles to omission and to culpability. There was legal wrangling too. The prosecution consulted with investigators about whether her passivity had crossed into criminal complicity. Did offering an envelope and maintaining silence equate to facilitating a cover-up? In some jurisdictions, failure to report a serious crime, obstruction of justice, or aiding in concealment can carry weight. Plea bargains and counsel consultations churned in rooms where lunch was eaten without the ease of the past. Amanda released a statement that read like a practiced apology. Regret for pain caused, an insistence that she had never intended harm, a promise to cooperate. It was the language of a life accustomed to shaping perception. But in private, when she closed doors and let the layers of public messaging fall away, she felt a rawness that had no eloquent phrasing. She thought of Philip, of the blind child on her lap in the first days, of the way his fingers had curled around her thumb with an assurance she had once mistook for unconditional possession. She thought of the envelope she had given Jacob, and how, in the privacy of her choices, she had created a quiet altar of convenience. She sat in a quiet room, and for the first time in years allowed her hands to be idle. There was a grief there that did not look like repentance. It looked like the disclosure of a life built on quiet trade-offs. The legal process moved forward in its own rhythm. Witnesses called, depositions taken, phone records examined. Amarka's defense tried to argue she had acted in the child's best interest, that a family known to them had been more equipped to provide for a child in particular ways. That defense was a thin reed against tapes and payments. Dr. Admi's medical judgment was attacked for being compromised by receipts and favors that suggested he had managed rooms and charts, not according to ethics, but according to the rhythms of patronage. He pleaded guilty to several counts related to professional misconduct, an outcome that bought him a reduced sentence but did not erase what had been done. Amarka fought harder, but the weight of evidence was against her. She faced charges that could send her to prison. Chisholm and Emma were dealt with for their street crimes. Assault charges, intimidation, and other violent offenses accrued as witnesses stepped forward. For Jacob, there was a grim satisfaction when the men who had broken bones and instilled fear were booked and processed. He did not welcome their suffering. He only felt that there was a balance being sought, however imperfectly. He watched them in courtrooms with the same curiosity as anyone watching men who had once seemed invincible, now measured against the scales of law. Amanda's public journey did not end in handcuffs. For reasons that belonged to the calculus of power and the specifics of her legal team, she was not immediately imprisoned. She was, however, subject to civil suits that sought restitution for the pain inflicted and the years of a child's life diverted. The legal pressure forced her to negotiate in terms that were not comfortable for someone who had spent a life shaping outcomes. She made payments to charity with clauses attached. She funded medical interventions in ways that read like contrition and like PR in equal measure. She agreed to a mediated settlement with Jacob that would secure Philip's immediate needs and set up a trust for the child's education. These were transactions, legal and financial, that might help a child someday. They could not, however, return the years stolen from father and son. The moral confrontation Jacob had expected finally arrived in a small conference room, not on television. Amanda sat across from him at a long table, her hands folded as always. The lawyers hovered like sharks at the edge of polite water. They had insisted on the meeting. The press wanted to know if there would be a reckoning beyond the courtroom. Jacob did not stand for a speech. He had rehearsed few lines. Anger could be a blunt instrument, and he had learned to be precise. When he looked at Amanda, he did not see the billboards or the foundations. He saw the woman who had chosen an envelope instead of a name. "What you did," Jacob said, his voice low but steady, "was buy space in my life. You bought silence where there should have been a voice." Amanda's eyes met his. For a moment, she did not look like the woman who had once walked through rooms that softened at her step. She looked like someone who had been caught at an action she had always excused. "I thought I was doing what was best," she said. "I thought I could protect the child, both children, by keeping things quiet. I thought the boy in my care would have the best possible life." "The best life?" Jacob repeated. "You call a life wrapped in tutors and procedures the best life if it means a child is kept from his father? If it means a man is beaten into silence?" The words built like a tide, and then ebbed. He felt his anger as a tangible thing, hard and hot. Amanda's voice was quieter now. "I am sorry for the pain you felt," she said. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to ensure safety." "Safety," Jacob said, and the word tasted wrong. "You gave envelopes and then let men beat me. You gave the boy a house and you took his childhood. You put a price on a life." She flinched, just slightly, as if the truth were a lash. Her apology, when it came, was honest but incomplete. "I am sorry," she said again. "I made a choice. I thought I was protecting—" "Protecting whom?" Jacob demanded. "Your name? Your work? Yourself?" Amanda had no easy counter. She had spent a life in rooms where fear of exposure had the power to topple entire projects. She had calculated public good against private cost in the abstract and, terrible human miscalculation, had chosen the former when confronted with a personal reckoning. There was no grand confession in the room. There was only an admission, small and raw, that she had valued certain things over the demands of moral courage. Mariam stood behind Jacob as she had stood behind him for years, a quiet force. She had come to the meeting with determined eyes. She did not speak until the conversation had thinned to near silence. "You took something from a family," she said. "You used your hands to decide what another should have. A man should not have to pay you for the chance to be a father." Amanda listened. In the faces across from her, she saw the cost of a choice that had seemed, in private, defensible. She felt suddenly and inexorably small. No litigation could entirely equal the shame of being recognized by those you had most harmed. For all the foundations and plaques and photographs, the human ledger had been kept, and it demanded an accounting. The conference ended with no sweeping absolution. Amanda agreed to waive certain rights, to fund a trust, to make public statements of responsibility. She did not, in that room or any other, make direct restitution for the years and the lost intimacy. Money cannot buy years. But there was a public undoing of sorts. She stepped down from roles. She publicly acknowledged mistakes and gave a longer statement about structural failures that allowed such a swap to happen. It was insufficient for some and necessary for others. For Jacob, the months that followed were full of bureaucratic tenderness and the tedious work of rebuilding a life into which another person had been stitched. He took parenting classes offered by the social services. He learned how to pick a medical appointment, how to talk to a teacher about a child's needs, how to explain absent years with the honesty the child could handle. Philip had been small and wary when they first met. He grew into a boy who trusted more with each meal and each story that Jacob shared. Helen, Jacob's daughter, adapted to having a brother in her house. She was curious and shocked and sometimes jealous, but also proud when Jacob read Philip the same stories he had read to her. Mariam found a new rhythm in a household that had always needed her steadiness. She became a partner in the public parts of Jacob's life as well, attending meetings and providing the quiet, unshowy love that made all the practical things possible. Peter, Amanda's blind child, remained a presence in the story like an echo. He had formed a bond with Amanda that was, in its own way, profound. He had tutors and medical attendants, and a life that could not be abruptly moved without trauma. Courts take the welfare of a child into account, not only biological ties. Amanda, now publicly chastened and legally constrained, was allowed to maintain guardianship of Peter because of his specialized needs and the continuity of care that transfer might have disrupted. It was a compromise the system often makes. Biology matters, but stability and care matter too. Jacob visited Peter, awkwardly at first. The small blind boy, no longer a baby, met Jacob's hand and patted it with an easy politeness. Jacob felt no less about that child because he knew the truth. He felt a complex, aching protectiveness that resisted simplistic solutions. There were nights when Jacob sat on the small stoop of his house and listened to the distance between his current life and the one he might have had. He knew that justice had been sought and partially achieved. People had been arrested, men had been subpoenaed, hospitals had been audited. But there were also wounds beyond the reach of papers and cameras. He had been humiliated in the market. He had been pounded into a place where silence had been the safer option. Reconstructing dignity is a different kind of labor. It happened slowly. A neighbor returning to lend a tool, a customer who trusted Jacob to fix their car again, a teacher complimenting the boy on a drawing. These small acts stacked into a sense that life could be more than the sum of its betrayals. Amanda's life, too, became quieter in a different way. She gave interviews that were clipped. She appeared in papers that described fall from influence with the steely, measured phrases custom-made for the public. She attended sessions where foundations discussed ethics and the ways institutions must guard against the corrosive power of private deals. She funded clinics with insistence and worked to change policies she had once assumed belonged to others. For some it was evidence of change. For others, it was further proof of the social power an elite person can apply to repair reputations. To Jacob, some of her actions were helpful, but that did not make them absolution. He found himself angry in small, precise ways. When he saw the child's tutor listed in a press release, when he heard a board accept her resignation with praise for her contributions. He did not want a theatrical collapse of Amanda's world. He wanted the human competence it took to say no when it mattered. He wanted the courage to put a hand up and refuse convenience. There were private moments of awkward civility. At a supervised visitation at the settlement center, Amanda and Jacob saw one another across a neutral room when Philip was brought to see the tutors who had taught him Braille. She had remained involved in medical decisions for Peter and had access to some shared resources. Their eyes met, and there was a mutual, uncomfortable recognition. They had both been parents in different ways to children whose lives were braided by a crime. Neither interaction erased the past. Neither meeting offered a narrative neat enough to be comforting. Jacob found himself reflecting on the idea of betrayal in a more expansive way. Betrayal, he realized, wore many costumes. Some were violent and obvious. Men in alleys with fists that told you where you belonged. Others wore the softer fabric of philanthropic rhetoric and buttons and press releases. Both did damage. He started to tell his story differently, not to the press, but to his son. He told Philip of the times in the garage, of the work of hands, not to teach bitterness, but to explain where he came from and the dignity of labor. He told Helen bedtime stories and let her ask about the world beyond their rooftop. He answered as honestly as a parent could without passing on his resentments. The public slowly moved on. Scandals are weather patterns, intense, and then, with enough days and enough new stories, they become background noise. Court filings continued. Fines were levied. Amaka's conviction, when it came, was a sentence that made news for a week. Dr. Admi received professional bans and a sentence that curtailed his practice. Chisholm and Emma were sentenced to terms for assault. Amanda's settlement with Jacob was finalized and pinned into legal documents that would follow Philip through childhood in the form of trusts and educational appointments. None of it made their nights less dry or their private recollections less sharp. But it did reassign consequences to actors rather than allowing the damage to be borne solely by the impoverished and vulnerable. Time, the slow sculptor, did its work in uneven strokes. Philip grew into a boy who could run and laugh and attend school with the normal annoyances of childhood. He learned to read and to love a story where the main character did not always succeed, but kept trying. He asked about the years he had missed, and Jacob, careful, patient, honest, answered in ways that did not villainize but explained. "You were in places you did not need to be," he told Philip once, "but you were always ours." Amanda eventually withdrew from certain public spaces. She still moved in social circles that once opened at her footsteps, but many doors had closed in the quiet that followed scandal. In rooms where people once laughed at her stories and praised her foundations, people now asked difficult questions. She felt the loneliness of consequence. It was not penitence made public. It was the private work of reconciling a life spent buying ease with a life now obliged to pay attention to the ways actions had ripple effects. Jacob did not find closure in any tidy scene. He did not become a celebrated hero in the papers. He returned to repair engines and to teach Philip how to change a tire, how to honor his tools, how to keep a family afloat when the market tightened. He and Mariam had fights as they learned to share a father across 2 households, to coordinate school pickups, to juggle medicine appointments. They argued about small things, money, time, food. They laughed about others, like the way Helen refused to share her crayons. Those ordinary fights were, in their stubbornness, a form of reconstruction. They made life look less like a wound and more like a mosaic. At night, Jacob sometimes dreamed of the nursery camera, the grainy eye that had witnessed the swap like a neutral god. The footage had become evidence and, in a way, a small vindication. But vindication had its own costs. It had required the exposure of private acts into public record. It had forced children into courtrooms and families into the light. There was no satisfaction in that, only a sense that truth had an appetite and that feeding it had consequences. The story did not end with a single verdict. It settled instead into a new pattern. Legal consequences for some, public shame for others, a reclaimed fatherhood for Jacob, a life of complicated caregiving for Amanda. Philip grew up with a father who taught him how to hold a wrench and an uncle in the form of a tutor who taught him Braille. Peter remained with Amanda, who, despite everything, continued to ensure his life was full of the resources he needed. The 2 boys lived in separate houses, but were bound forever by a history neither had chosen. On the anniversary of the day Jacob had first gone to the hospital, he took Philip to the small garage where he still worked. The 2 cribs motif, one in a hospital nursery long ago, one in a small room, had been replaced by the continued presence of 2 children's worlds that had once been entangled. Jacob let Philip slide a spanner across a bench. The boy's hands, calloused in a way that suggested new life for a man who had once known only oil-stained days, closed around it. Laughter rose in the garage, and for a sliver of time the world was ordinary and kind. Jacob did not forget the envelope. He kept it folded in a small drawer, not as a talisman, but as a lesson he would not let himself forget. That material consolation handed to the powerless in exchange for silence is itself a form of violence. He taught Philip about dignity, about the courage of speaking truth, about the cost of silence. He taught Helen to draw pictures that included more than one kind of home. He taught Mariam, and reminded himself, that love could be the beating heart that patched a family when others had cut it. Amanda watched some of it from a distance. She heard that Jacob had taught Philip to read the markings on a carburetor, and found herself surprised by a small private relief. A child she had once claimed for the safety of silence had the chance to learn, to laugh, to be steady with a father. She felt no right to that relief, only an aching, unwanted gratitude that had the quality of something she could not quite define. It was not absolution. It was not even forgiveness. It was the recognition that lives are complicated, and that the harm she had allowed was real. Justice, in that town and in that life, was not a finishing line but a process. There were cracks and repairs, sentences and settlements, arrests and apologies. There were moments of kindness and flashes of rage. There were days when Jacob walked home from the garage lighter, the weight of what had been stolen eased by the presence of his son at his side. There were nights when he woke with the memory of fists in a gutter and the thin paper of an envelope heavy in his palm. The ultimate betrayal, the one that made the title of his life for some, was not a single act, but a series of choices made by someone with the power to act differently. Amanda had not pulled the trigger of the swap with her own hands, but she had, through omission and through the purchase of silence, allowed a life to be rerouted. That is what framed Jacob's story. Not merely the swap, but the way the powerful can smooth the world for themselves while leaving others to stitch their own wounds. In the end, Jacob's life was altered, scarred, but alive. He had his son, messy and loving and incomplete in all the ways a real family can be. He had a wife who stood by him. He carried scars that would not be written off by settlements. He had the truth, blood and image and testimony to speak for the years he had lost. Amanda carried her own burdens, public remorse, legal obligations, and the private knowledge that she had been capable of choosing comfort over courage. They lived forward, therefore, in the only way possible, imperfectly and with attention. There was no neat moral stitching tying up the hurt, no Hollywood closing shot. There were visits and court dates, moments of tenderness and days of legal drudgery. There was, most importantly, a child who learned to trust and a father who learned to show up. If you want to see what justice looks like next, how these lives continue to rebuild, how the children fare, and whether the wounds of power and silence can ever fully heal, subscribe and tell us what you think should happen.